Hello, grade 6 and 7 historians. So, this is going to be a combined lesson for both of you because sevens were learning about the history of early Canada in the 1700s, and sixes, we are looking at different communities in Canada and how they helped contribute to the Canadian identity. And one of those really strong groups of people were the Acadians. So, sevens, you'll remember this. Sixes, this is sort of new to you. That after 1713 and the Treaty of Utrecht, which took place sort of over in France and England and Spain, and to try and get them to stop fighting, some of the lands in North America switched hands from French to English, and it was part of the treaty, part of the rules for this treaty to keep French and English from fighting each other. So this little spot here, this stripy bit here, was Acadia. So it was previously French controlled. And the people that lived there, the Acadians, were French of French descent. But after the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, this land became under English ownership. Okay, so that's kind of where we leave off as we learn about the Acadians. So the Acadians came to North America mostly from France. Yet they weren't really like other French people. They spoke their own version of French, called Acadian French, and they didn't tend to hang around with the French. They stayed in their own space. A lot of the other French colonists were on the other side of the St. Lawrence River in what is now Montreal and Quebec City. They really even didn't consider themselves French. By the time a couple of generations had lived on the land in North America, they really considered themselves Acadians. And this was a really interesting sort of cultural connection between who they were in France and then the world that they found here in North America. So they had to adjust their culture to meet the new challenges in North America, and they created this wonderful new culture called the Acadians. They had a very distinct culture that made them very different from the other French settlers. They were innovative farmers and even developed a system of draining the salty, marshy lands near the shore and converting it to farmland. Most of the other farmers who came from France were tree fellers. They would find a large piece of forest and they would spend a ridiculous amount of time cutting down the trees, taking out the roots, taking out the stumps, and turning it into arable farmland. The Acadians, they had been sort of pushed around a little bit until they found this space in what is now New Brunswick. And it was kind of boggy, swampy, and it would get the saltwater marshes around the edge of the coast were perfect for them. So they found a way to drain these salty marshes, and actually, what was left behind was very fertile earth. They created this one way dam system like this that was useful for the tides, and this is called an aboiteau. And this system allowed the swamp water to drain out during low tide, but it kept the water from coming back in. You can see right down here, there's this little trap door, and right here. So during low tide, the water would go out, and then during high tide, this little trap door would prevent the water from coming back in. So they could actually keep and maintain a very dry space of arable land. They were very clever farmers. Some of the French colonists who lived in Montreal area and Quebec area really thought that they were lazy because it was a lot of work to take down the trees and take out the stumps and make this usable farmland. And here were the Acadians, and they were simply building these fancy aboiteaux, these dams, and the water would drain away, and then they'd have their land. So some of the French thought that they were rather lazy compared to the rest of the French that were there. After one war between Britain and France, which Britain won, the two sides signed a peace treaty called the Treaty of Utrecht. And grade sevens, we talked about that earlier. In this treaty, France agreed to hand over to Britain the territory in New France where the Acadians lived. So again, this is this stripy bit right here. France encouraged the Acadians to relocate to another part of New France. They said, you know what, you are French citizens through and through. Come over and we will find you some new land. And the Acadians, though, were like, no, we really like it here. We've set up a community here. We're not really like you anymore. We've created our own culture and we want to stay in our own space. The treaty allowed for the Acadians to continue living there. So even though the English took over this space, the French, um, even though the English took over the space, the treaty said that they could not be taken from the land. They were allowed to live there still if they so chose. The British tried really hard to assimilate them, bring them into their culture, turn them into British subjects. But the Acadians refused. They said, no, you know what? We are who we are. We're not really French, but we're certainly not English. We're just going to be us, and we just like to stay and live where we are. The British knew that this Treaty of Utrecht was not going to last forever back in Europe, and they knew that this war would continue into North America as well, and that France and England were going to fight at some point. So they were concerned about these Acadians. Could these French Acadians be trusted to not fight against the British? So here are these French citizens living on British soil. What would happen if there was a war in that area? Who would these Acadians fight for? Would they stand up and fight for the English, who now control the land, or would they side with the French, which is technically their country of birth? To be sure, the British demanded that the Acadians swear an oath of allegiance. This oath asked that the Acadians swear that they will not fight with the French if there was another war, and in fact that they would fight for the British. The Acadians promised to not fight for anybody. They promised that they would remain neutral, that they didn't want to fight for the French because they really didn't feel themselves to be French. But they also didn't want to fight for the English because they definitely weren't English. So they said, can we just be neutral? Can we just fight for nobody? If another war comes out, we will fight for nobody. We will not take sides. Is this good enough? And the English, unfortunately, said no. So, surely, the inevitable happened. In the year 1744, the British again started to fight France in Europe. Fighting also broke out in Acadia, since both the British and the French wanted this land. If you remember correctly, this land is right at the beginning of the St. Lawrence River. And so it's a really important piece as more troops are coming into North America. This is the perfect place for them to land. The Acadians feared that the British would attack them, so most of the Acadians hid in the woods during the battles, because they knew that if the British saw them still as French, that they might be in jeopardy. Some Acadians did break the rules and provided the French with some supplies. They didn't fight with them, mostly. There was a very few that fought, but most of the time they didn't fight with them, but they would provide them food and water and shelter to the French colonies. Word got out that some Acadians were in fact helping the French, and the British were really, really angry with these Acadians because they had promised to stay neutral, refused to sign this oath of allegiance, but clearly that seemed to be a lie because some of the Acadians were giving some help to the French, most of the time not in the form of fighting, but in the form of supplies. So, what was going to happen to these Acadians? Well, the British couldn't trust them because they were mostly French. And the French couldn't trust them because they refused to come over to the other side of the river and actually become part of the French culture again. So this group of people that just wanted to be left alone were really stuck in the middle. So about 10 years later, again, in 1755, there was yet another war in England and France over in Europe. The governor of Nova Scotia, which means New Scotland, was so concerned about the Acadians helping the French last time that again they brought up the oath of allegiance. They said, you know what? Last time we asked you to sign this and you didn't. and you help the French. This time, there's going to be another war. We're asking you to sign this oath of allegiance. And again, the Acadians said no. So this time, though, the governor, the British governor, was ready for the refusal. This time he had a solution to the problem, and I'm using the quotation marks, the problem, already figured out. He announced that all Acadians would be expelled. Expelled means basically removed by force, that they would be expelled from that part of Nova Scotia that they called Acadia. So basically, the British governor said to the French Acadians, we are going to move you. If you don't want to go, we will move you by force. We will force you to leave. Forcing people to leave their homeland, they had farmed for over 100 years, was bad enough. But how the British did it was cruel and heartless. Because a lot of the people who lived in Acadia had been born in North America. They had never been to France or England. And really, their connection was to the land, not to either one of the French or English cultures. The Acadian leaders were asked to come to a church in the town of Grand Pre for a meeting. And they were told by the British Colonel Winslow, that they had only a few minutes to gather what they could before they would be shipped away on boats and their land would be taken for the British. The people were escorted by gunpoint down to the shore where British ships were ready to take them away. So they were brought into a community hall and said, you have only a matter of minutes to gather the important things that you need, gather your families, get down to the ships, get onto the ships, and we're going to move you to where we want you to go. The scene, of course, as you can imagine, was horrible. It was devastating. Families were ignored as people were rounded up and placed onto the ships. Mom and dad and kids were often put onto different ships, headed to different locations. The British couldn't speak the French language that the Acadians spoke. And in fact, the Acadian language was French, but had been sort of changed and altered over time living in North America. And so it wasn't pure French either. And so there was a lot of miscommunication, and families were torn apart, and children were lost and put onto these ships headed for different places. The British made sure that there was no reason for the Acadians to ever come back. So once the people had left their farms, the British went back in and they burned their homes. Their animals were killed and their crops were destroyed. So not only did they just take this stuff for themselves, but they said that this stuff is useless and valueless, and we are going to destroy it. We would rather destroy it than use your Acadian stuff. British soldiers were sent to the woods to search for the Acadians who might have been hiding and trying to find their way over to French settlements. Determined that this was the best thing to do to get them out, here's a picture. This is a recreation, and this is a painting of Colonel John Winslow. Right? So this is the guy who was told to get rid of the Acadians. The British couldn't remove all the Acadians at one time. There was just actually too many of them. The initial movement, that first initial day, there were thousands and thousands that moved. But in fact, it did take years for this to all happen. Between 1755 and 1763, 7,000 of the 10,000 Acadians living in Nova Scotia were forced from their homes. Most didn't know where they were being sent to, although some did have a choice. So sometimes they went to other French colonies. So you can see this little line here. Some of them went easily enough across the river, St. Lawrence River, to other French colonies. However, most of them were returned to France, which was a bit of a shock because, as I said before, most of these people had never been to France. They were born and raised, and even their parents were born and raised in the new country, in North America. And so to take them to France, this was not their homeland. Some were taken to England, Some were shipped simply to other parts of Nova Scotia, and others were taken to other British colonies down along the eastern seaboard and as far as the Caribbean. So some were taken down to places in Louisiana and some were taken down to the Caribbean islands. These people had done nothing wrong. Yet the Acadians were caught in the middle of two very powerful nations fighting over land. Because of this, their land was taken, their families were torn apart, and many were sent to foreign countries that they did not know. One group of Acadians settled in New Orleans, in the southern US, in what is now Louisiana. They told everyone they were Acadians, but over time, the word was mispronounced and changed a little, and today we call them Cajuns. In time, many of the Acadians returned to Canada, but their original farms were destroyed and had been given over to the British peoples. So they were forced to relocate into a small area in New Brunswick. History may have forgotten about this group of Canadian settlers, but there's a famous poem called Evangeline, written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And it tells the story of a young girl, Evangeline, who was forced to leave Acadia during the expulsion. Evangeline is separated from her family and her fiancé and sent to another country. Their final words to each other are a vow that they will return to their homeland someday together. She does return to Acadia, waits for her fiancé to return. She finally meets him many years again when he returns, but he is on board a ship where most people are sick and diseased. Evangeline learns that her fiancé is one of the sick and near death. She stays with him during the final days before he dies. As more and more people learn of this horrible moment in Canadian history, the Acadians are becoming quite famous. They now have their own flag, and you can go down to the area and you can see Acadian museums that are specifically designed to tell about the Acadian history. There are Acadian festivals and reunions and celebration, both in Canada and in Louisiana, that help teach people around the world about the Acadians and their problems. Recently, the Canadian and the British governments officially apologized for the Acadian expulsion and basically said, we're really sorry. 300 years ago, we were kind of mean to you, and we're really sorry for what happened. All right, so the Acadians, there they are. There's a little bit of information about them. They're a really powerful group of people who make a really important impression on the fabric of Canada, that which makes us Canada, because we know that Canada has two official languages, French and English, and we know that a good chunk of our land, especially around the eastern seaboard and the St. Lawrence River, was continually fought over. And the Acadians were a group of people who got caught in the middle. But without them, Canada and Canadians would be very different. Thanks for listening, guys.